In contrast, writes Hayek, there is another tradition of law that sees all rules in society as rising from the state, and always and everywhere must amount to a restriction on the liberty of the individual. The exponents of this view include the tyrants and despots of the ancient world, and in modern times, Thomas Hobbes and Karl Marx. The writings of the latter two are the preeminent influence over what we today call the right and the left. It is impossible to understand this view of government without first understanding the illiberal view of society. The illiberal view regards society as essentially unworkable on its own because it is riddled with conflicting interests. Let us begin with the left. They believe society has fundamental flaws and deep-rooted conflicts that keep it in some sort of structural imbalance. All these conflicts and disequilibria cry out for government fixes. For leftists are certain that there is no social problem that a good dose of power can't solve. If the conflicts they want are not there, they make them up. They look at what appears to be a happy suburban subdivision and see pathology. They see an apparently happy marriage and imagine it is a mask for abuse. They see a thriving church and think the people inside are being manipulated by a cynical and corrupt pastor. Their view of the economic system is the same. They see poor peasants in the third world drinking a Coke or making Nikes and cry exploitation. They figure that prices don't reflect reality, but instead are set by large players. There is a power imbalance at the heart of every exchange domestically and internationally. The labor contract is a mere veneer to cover exploitation. To the brooding leftist, it is inconceivable that people can work out their own problems. That trade can be to people's mutual advantage. That society can be essentially self-managing, or that attempts to use government to reshape and manage people might backfire. Their faith in government knows few limits. Their faith in people is thin or non-existent. This is why they are a danger to liberty. The remarkable fact about the conflict theory of society held by the left is that it ends up creating more of the very pathologies they believe have been there from the beginning. The surest way to drive a wedge between labor and capital is to regulate the labor markets to the point that people cannot make voluntary trades. Both sides begin to fear each other. It is the same with relations between races, sexes, the able and disabled, or any other groups you can name. It is the same with international relations. A tariff or trade sanction is nothing but war by another means. The very path to creating a conflict where none need exist is to put a government bureaucracy in charge. This view is at the heart of the old socialist vision. They believed that the key conflict in society was between those who owned capital and those who worked for capital. The gain of the capitalist always came at the expense of labor. Similarly, the advance of labor can only come from the expropriation of the capitalist class through a revolution that is just because the laborers are only taking back what was expropriated from them. Now, as time has passed, we've come to see the error in this view. Capital and labor do not exist in fundamental conflict. Their relations are managed by contract in the same way that relations between laborers and capitalists are managed by contract. Moreover, these two groups are not hermetically sealed off from each other. Capitalists are workers, and workers can be capitalistic owners of their own property. Only in the most primitive stages of development does it appear otherwise. Once it became obvious that Marxism had mischaracterized the workings of capitalism, the left looked for other forms of conflict to confirm their worldview. Most recently, they have begun to advance the idea that man's interests can only be pursued at the expense of nature. The flourishing of one occurs at the flourishing of the other. Thus it is that a seemingly happy and prosperous people could in reality be doing deadly damage to the earth, the interests of which can only be advanced at the expense of prosperous consumers and producers. The left accepts the reality that this will make everyone poorer, as indeed all forms of socialism do, but they tell us this is good for us and good for the planet. The traditional and correct answer to the conflict theory is that there is essentially nothing government can do to improve the workings of society. During the Great Depression, for example, most everyone on the left thought that government was the only way out. The hard left favored communist revolution, the soft left favored the New Deal. The old liberals pointed out that it was government itself that had brought about the crisis, and that more government intervention could only make matters worse. This was the rational response, but it did not carry the day. After the Second World War, we saw the emergence of a strange creature in American life, something that called itself conservatism. It was opposed to the left in American life, particularly that branch that was sympathetic to communism. It counseled vagaries like prudence in public life, but in a crucial way, it adopted one tenet of the leftist worldview. It rejected old liberalism as a vision for how society can work in the absence of government. It adopted a conflict view of society, a different brand rooted in the assertions of Hobbes rather than Marx. The idea that conflict was at the very heart of society, absent government, was a key aspect of this. This new thing called conservatism adopted some of the rhetoric of the old right. It defended property and economic enterprise, but what was critical was the introduction of a notion that society, if left to its own devices, would collapse into chaos. This was particularly true in international affairs. So while the Cold War was originally an invention of the Democrat Harry Truman, it was tailor-made to appeal to conservatives who were looking for an ideological enemy to slay. It is one thing to say that communism is an evil ideological system. It is another to say that we cannot rest until every communist is killed and every communist government wiped from the face of the earth. What happened to the non-interventionist views of the old right? They were predicated on the idea that there could be a leaderless world order, that nations could best get along without an overarching authority and source of law. But after the war, that too began to change. A new conviction arose. Russell Kirk wrote in 1954 that, quote, "Civilized society requires distinctions of order, wealth, and responsibility, and it cannot exist without true leadership. Society longs for just leadership," he said. He contrasted this view with what he considered the erroneous opinion of Ludwig von Mises. Mises, wrote Kirk, had exaggerated faith in the rationality of individuals. Kirk, in contrast, sees that all of history is governed by two great forces, love and hate. Neither are rational impulses, he says, in order to achieve the triumph of love over hate. The conservative, quote, "looks upon government as the great power for good." And so conservatives threw themselves behind the force of government to achieve their aims. And no matter how many wicked things government did over the years under conservative control, they always told themselves that it was surely better than the much-feared alternative of an unmanaged society. Kirk became more explicit as the years went on, and after the old liberalism was refashioned by Rothbard as libertarianism, conservatives began to define themselves in opposition to all forms of liberalism. The government that had many things to do in this world, they said. The police, with the thin blue line that separated chaos from order. And forget just how awful the police often are in reality. The US military empire was all that stood between us and Soviet domination. They paid no attention to the fact that the Soviet economy always had been and always would be a basket case. They became cheerleaders of government power of a different sort. Frank Chodorov was so upset with tendencies on the right that he once said, "Anyone who calls me a conservative gets a punch in the nose." We've lived now through 6 years of a Republican president backed by conservatives who still escapes fundamental criticism by them. After promises of a humble foreign policy, war and war spending define our era. We're told that every problem with war can be solved through more force, that there is nothing necessarily wrong with imprisoning people without cause and without legal representation, that torture can be a legitimate tactic, that some countries have to be destroyed in order to be made free, and that we can have all the welfare and all the warfare we desire at virtually no cost, thanks to the miracle of central banking and debt-driven economic growth. Now, some people say that the real problem with the Bush administration is that it's too far left and that a genuine right-wing government would be better. I'm disinclined to believe that. For I detect in the Bush administration's philosophy of government something that departs from the left in many ways, except in its unlimited faith in government to keep order, that is, to exercise force and the threat of force.